Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Frozen Assets podcast series where we're focusing on entrepreneurship in the freeze drying space specifically. And today we're going to talk to EIS Automation. This company is very agnostic with different products that they help businesses scale their efficiencies in production. And it made a lot of sense for me to bring on Josh, who's the owner of EIS, because even though we're doing freeze drying, it's still a product that needs to be packaged. There's a lot of us that have either grown a business to the scale that we want it to, or you're kind of stuck in this middle ground of like, what is the next step for me? I've got a lot of demand for my product and I need to figure out ways to, one, maybe purchase more freeze dryers. I need to find a way to reduce my labor that I'm doing because it's very stressful. So we're going to talk about that with Josh today. How does freeze drying apply to what he does for his clients in automation? Josh, thanks for joining me on this podcast and helping us better understand automation for packaging products. So I want to have you introduce yourself and tell us about what EIS does and why you started it, and kind of dumb it down for us of what you actually do for clients.
Yeah, thank you, David. I'm Josh with EIS Automation. I'm the founder of the business. We are in our 12th year. I founded a business in Las Vegas in the quintessential American fashion of in the garage on the knees. And now we are close to a 15,000 square feet facility. And over time, our focus has shifted to the automation world, specifically a subsegment of that automation world, which we call end of line product handling and packaging. That can include many different types of packaging. It's not necessarily limited to food. It could be any type of other product. What's more important for us is not so much what the product is, but it's in a given size range. So if we package or handle a product, doesn't matter too much for us whether or not we package or handle a mouse, or if it's freeze-dried food. As long as it's within a given payload and size range, then it's a good fit for us and we can bring value to the customer's table. End of line, basically, sometimes also referred as end of line, as second half of line, typically involves some sort of manipulation of the product. That could be batching, stacking, sorting, weighing. It gets packaged into a secondary container. And everything around that is what we specialize in, oftentimes including robotics, all the way down to the palletizer, bringing the product on a pallet.
I would think that you're using a lot of robotics. Or what types of things would I pay attention to if I was going to look up on videos and things like that? What does the actual machine or things look like?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And this is actually a very common topic. Maybe to step back a little bit, what's happening in the US right now is a little bit of a revival of manufacturing. So the United States becomes a country again that manufactures products and brings manufacturing back home from maybe overseas. And so there's two types of customers: new manufacturers that start a product, and then also customers who bring manufacturing activity back, which is called under the umbrella reshoring. When you are a smaller manufacturer, typically you start out doing everything by hand and you're at a small scale. So as you grow over time, your volume goes up. You start to sit down and think about, how can I put out this larger volume in a repeatable fashion, right? And that of course includes, you just alluded to it, a big portion of that is what we call touch point reduction. Touch point reduction is especially important in the food industry, where ideally you have as few touch points, human touch points, as possible for the food to stay fresh and also not get touched and contaminated in the process. So when you have foods and many other products too outside of the food industry, typically you have two stages. You have what is called primary packaging. That is the actual product itself packaged maybe in a bag, a pre-made bag, or it is in a flow wrap package. Like you go to a grocery store and you see a Snickers bar and it has three fins or three seals, the two seals at the end and a third seal on the bottom. That's called a flow wrapping product. And the flow wrapper is a quintessential primary packaging. Now, when you distribute a product, then oftentimes you distribute it in batches or larger amounts. So you might have seen in the store that the individual Snickers bars, for example, are inside a carton.
Huh.
And that would be considered a secondary packaging process. This is typically what we are involved in more. Sometimes we get involved in the primary packaging. That means your freeze-dried good would make it into a pre-made bag, for example. And then many of these pre-made bags get then inserted into a carton for distribution purposes.
Yeah. And when you're talking about different types of ways to do end of line or kind of reduce the touch points, I just thought of something, when you're looking at a commercial grade freeze dryer, which is most likely the companies that are going to be paying attention to this podcast
Yeah.
about, you're looking to actually get out of the home freeze dryer. At least you probably have close to a dozen of these, and you're looking at a commercial grade freeze dryer that has a larger footprint, but can do more batches and, or more product within one cycle time. So I can kind of see it as like a lot of these commercial grade freeze dryers have these large stacking racks, but they come on wheels out of the freeze dryer. I guess the ways that to reduce that touch point would be that you're going to roll those stands with all those racks of freeze dried product to an area that has robotic arms that kind of like dump the product out of those trays and then put them on an assembly line to get packaged. Is that a very layman's term scenario?
Yeah, you could do that. As a matter of fact, it's very close to one of the ways you could do it. So the automation industry you can think of, there's two approaches. You have typically heavily standardized equipment that could serve many industries. So you could say, I have a feeding device that fills the bag, and that is a standard piece of equipment. But now you say, we have freeze-dried goods, and they're almost similar to maybe a baking sheet, and you would like to automatically take the sheet out and empty it into a bulk feeder, for example, right? So this would be more of a custom project where you would work with a robotics company where you say, hey, I have all these different racks with casters, and I would like to bring them to X location and then have a robot pull each sheet, empty it, for example, into a hopper. And then from that hopper, you have a feeder and a weigher and automatically feed them into a pre-made bag, for example.
Yeah.
While the pre-made bagging machine being a standard piece of equipment, but the robotic side of things would be a somewhat custom device.
From the outside looking in, it really appears that getting a machine to do that to increase production time, which is great for me, it's only really possible for a large company with big pocketbooks. Is that true?
Maybe historically that was the case, but not necessarily today anymore. So there's equipment available, and we cater towards many customers who are maybe below 10 employees, right? It doesn't always have to be a very expensive capital expenditure piece of equipment. When you scale a business and you're at a given stage with your business and a certain volume, oftentimes there are smaller tabletop systems available you could purchase. So you can basically step through and purchase equipment that grows with you. Of course, oftentimes what people think about when you think of automation is a large machine and everything is fully automated. But oftentimes that really is only the end kind of system and the upper echelon type of system. But there's many steps in between. And typically, a very typical path is to go a path of semi-automation, right?
Right.
So you might automate certain aspects of your process that is very intensive, labor intensive. And also the reasons why you automate might not be the same for everyone, right? In the food world, the automation might be, the reason might be to avoid maybe any trouble with the FDA, and you don't want any touch points, right? For another company, the automation, the main driver might be ergonomics, right? To eliminate repetitive motion injuries and things like this, right? So automation can have many reasons to be implemented. In the end, I always say automation is a really good fit for highly repetitive tasks. And in the end, people don't want to be robots, right? For lack of a better term. So if you do something 70 several thousand times a day on a given shift, the issue that oftentimes comes along with that is, is the retention of the employees. Workers' comp cost might go up because of repetitive motion or ergonomics issues, and quality suffers because we simply can't focus for extended periods of times on a repetitive task. Humans are not built to do that, while a robot or a piece of equipment will repeatedly do it in the same fashion, no matter how many hours it has run that day. So you're solving in multiple layers of problems when you take the step of automation.
A lot of people who are freeze drying get into different modes and processes that they've just always known. It's tough to kind of shift your mindset to that things could be done better, even though you've always done it the other way. And one of those that I've always done is I've always physically stamped my bags. I actually have one of my bags right here, and I physically stamp my bags on here. Now I am small enough, but I definitely can see how I'm not meant to do it like 500 bags at a time. I can stamp about 100, and then my mind kind of goes to like, I need a break, or my accuracy kind of changes because I just need a mental break from that, versus I can see that if I did go to something that could print off the labels, in bulk, it's like that machine doesn't get tired. It just runs out of ink. So it's
that's correct. Yeah.
very different.
Yeah.
And I think people who are listening too, I think about any of the workers that you have, or even if you're still doing it yourself, I know what people are doing. And especially with freeze dried Skittles or other type of candy, you are literally taking your hand or you're taking a scoop and you're dumping it into a bag or a container.
Correct.
That's because you kind of hit the threshold of how much labor you're willing to put into doing that for how many periods of time. And if you're at the point right now where you're like, this is causing me stress, it's causing me to think about exiting doing my business because I've been doing it for years, the reason to talk to someone like yourself is worth it, even for a consult, because you can kind of see like, wow, yeah, I could be focusing on marketing. I could be focusing on sales. I could be focusing on the things that don't require a ton of labor to do that.
That's correct. And what you're describing is very common for us to actually go into a company and tour the facility and help these potential customers to identify areas that would be a good fit for automation. Exactly like you described, you're a specialist in making freeze-dried foods, and the next customer is maybe a gift card manufacturing customer. They're good at making gift cards all day. Everyone has their focus, but you might not know exactly what is out there that could help me increase productivity, maintain quality, and also lower my unit cost, right? So that's typically where we come in. Oftentimes can identify areas fairly quickly where we can bring true value to an operation. We will only do that for the areas, of course, where that's our strength. And we will maybe refer customers to other companies that they're served better there. Automation just tends to be a fairly large term where a lot of things are lumped together. So, but if you have a good partner and you are a manufacturer who is in growth mode, I think it's very important to early on start to think about an automation strategy. And that is something that is not ad hoc and happens only for 3 months. This is almost something that goes along with the things that you just mentioned several times. Marketing is something that you want to do continuously. It's not something I only do for 2 months out of the year. I always describe automation. It's like brushing teeth. You don't do it for 12 hours once a year, right? You do it, for a few minutes twice a day, every day of the year, right? And that's what will get you the results, right? And when you come into that manufacturing space from a competition perspective, when you look at it from a marketplace perspective, you'll always oftentimes see that the companies who have implemented that strategy, and even if they've only gotten maybe 10, 15% better every year, after 3 years, that company is 45% ahead of the competition.
I think of like a real world example. I supply my freeze-dried fruit to a company that does corporate gift baskets. And the only thing that they have in automation that they invested in was a like shrink wrapping machine.
Yeah.
So they have different types of baskets for different sizes so that they can fit different types of products.
Hmm.
And so there might be 10 or 12 or a dozen, whatever type of products there are, but they have different baskets. Well, she had told me that when they first started, the lady that they bought it from, she was wrapping those things herself and tying the bows and doing all these things. And they quickly found out that they didn't want to do that anymore. So they bought this machine that
Yes.
literally they just put the basket with everything on it and it goes on a conveyor belt and it has about the size of a microwave area
Correct.
that goes in the basket, goes through, and it literally shrink wraps it, seals it, and makes the little fine print like glue to it. And then out comes a perfectly shrink
Mhm.
wrapped
Correct.
corporate gift basket.
Yes.
And it's the way that they do things. Now they are seasonal. So come September and October and November, they are making so many. So that was really important for them to have that type of automation for that.
Mhm.
So I wanted to bring that up. So that makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. And
And
that's only
shrink,
one machine.
that's one machine. And shrink wrapping is very common together with flow wrapping. Um, we have had customers that they have had a heat gun in their hand and literally wrap things by hand and then use the heat gun to shrink each individual piece. And once they get a shrink wrap machine, all of a sudden they can wrap 35 pieces a minute, where before they did maybe 2 a minute, right?
Yes.
So automation always requires some volume, right? I think that's you have to justify it with the volume, but once you're at that stage, it doesn't have to be incredibly expensive. To take your point with the shrink wrap, really small shrink wrap units, they probably start at around $7,500, right?
Yeah.
And that's a really well built unit, maybe from Taiwan, and that'll give you service for many years to come. And then there's many different pieces of equipment all the way to full automation. But you can step through, and the equipment oftentimes can just grow with you.
Joshua, I want to talk about stages. What are the
Yeah.
indicators based on your experience with clients today and in the past that have caused them to actually say, enough is enough? I need to go start looking at researching end of line systems. What are those indicators?
Especially when the last, maybe after COVID, it has shifted a little bit, and not so much that we have to point out or help customers find the place for automation. What really has happened, especially after COVID, is that people approach us and say, we can't produce because we can't find employees. And if we find them, we can't retain them, right? So this never ending cycle of hiring, rehiring, retraining makes quality suffer so bad that they want to go to automation. In the past, it was more that we had to help them maybe point out areas. Now that really has shifted quite a bit, that we are approached actively with the fact that people simply can't produce anymore because they can't find people who want to do these highly repetitive tasks day in and day out. And when they find people, they oftentimes quickly, leave these positions again. So that is where we're entering the world of maybe a misconception about the automation world, right? And especially robotics, because it's oftentimes portrayed as something that eliminates positions or jobs. The reality is really that people don't want to do these jobs in the first place. What this automation oftentimes does is, and we see this over and over again with customers in just about any field, is that it increases employee retention, because now these people that otherwise would have left are now being given a meaningful task. And now they have a sense of pride in that job. They have a sense of career path in front of them, instead of waking up or worrying on a Sunday night, oh my God, tomorrow I have this 8-hour shift where I have to do this motion 16,000 times a day. That's not something to look forward to, right?
Right.
So these are automations automation systems that make perfect sense, and these people now will stay. I had one customer specifically tell me that there was concern in the group of employees about the first ever robot taking the jobs away. And after 6, 7, or 8 months of the robot working in the facility, being deployed and now the fear went away, and now they call themselves robot operators. Right? So
Yeah.
it shifted from fear to a sense of pride of the technology, right?
Yeah, and I can see that practically speaking. You think about the minimum wage that all of our states have, but also we're evolving to where it's really expensive with inflation and the cost of living in America, that people need higher pay, and that's why they're not staying in jobs too. And so if you're paying someone, especially to unwrap freeze-dried or unwrap candy so that it can be freeze-dried, if you're paying someone even, let's say, $15 an hour, multiply that by about 2,000, which is the average hours in a given year. That's $30,000 average pay. But I would think that you're making money on that employee if they stick around for the entire year doing that kind of mundane task. But if they leave and you have to retrain 3 people in that year for the same job at $15, you've probably spent 3 times that salary in cost. Correct. Just in time and training. So if that machine costs you $30,000 to automate what they're doing, you're already saving money on your training and trying to find those people. So I agree with you. Yeah, it's something you have to be open to, and so you have to kind of adapt to what the market is like. It's just the facts.
When you look at product cycles in the consumer world, then it's totally normal for us to purchase a new phone, a new laptop every and when you look at a new phone and then you have a new release, and this year it's green instead of orange, whatever the case might be, right? But we're used to fast product cycles. In the manufacturing world, that is somewhat exactly the polar opposite, because you're investing in a piece of equipment that might give you another 10, 15 years of service, right? Until it reaches its end of life. And when you have something that provides you a service that's long, people always look at the high cost that you just described. And so now it's a justification of labor savings, right? And the equipment or automation industry actually has evolved with that. So historically, you would look at a proposal, a quote for a piece of equipment, and that would clearly be in the capital expenditure category, right? You have to have the funds. You might have to go to the bank and get a loan. Somehow you have to pay this big upfront cost and spread it over many years of operation, right? So the equipment and automation industry has actually evolved with, I think, this new need for a different approach in how to get equipment to manufacturers, and that is shifting the capital expenditure into an operational expense. So what you find more and more, and we are included in that to some extent, is that equipment is not offered only for sale as an outright sale offer, but you have systems or abbreviations, I think stolen a little bit from the software world, SaaS, software as a service. Now you have MaaS, machine as a service. You have RaaS, robot as a service, right? And all of a sudden, you don't have to come up with this large expense up front, but you're essentially getting a piece of equipment for a continuous monthly operational expense, almost like an employee, without having to come up with this large lump sum at the time of purchase.
What is the difference between a business using capital expenditure versus making it an operating expense?
And this really depends on how the company runs financially. And smaller companies, oftentimes, there's not the capital available just sitting in a bank account in form of cash to purchase a piece of equipment. So if you go the automation route, there might be smaller items available, like I just described, these very semi-automatic shrink wrap that starts at maybe $7,500. But the reality is, when you're entering the equipment world, you'll also quickly venture out in the 6 figures plus, right? So let's say a company is at a stage where it is ready to, could really benefit from a piece of equipment that would automate a certain aspect of the process. And let's say that's $125,000. But most businesses do not have this kind of cash sitting around. So their only option would be to continue the way they have been and maybe save up until they reach that point, and it could be years in the future, or they approach a bank for a capital equipment loan, as a capital loan for the equipment. Or now manufacturers offer the machine as a service, so to speak. So they say, hey, we'll give you this machine, and instead of purchasing it from us, we're going to do a 36 months plan or whatever the case may be. And instead of coming up with this large lump sum up front, you can have this piece of equipment maybe for, let's say, I'm going to throw a number out, $5,000 a month. And that includes the wear and tear parts and phone support, for example.
Yeah.
And this way, that makes it much more accessible to a manufacturer who doesn't maybe even want to spend the money. Maybe some customers have the money, but they don't want to pour all that cash reserve into a piece of equipment, but can, with their operational income they have every month, just cover the cost of that piece of equipment. And oftentimes with these processes, there is a buyout option in a few years where you've used a piece of equipment, you like it, and now you've already used it, and then there's a lower buyout option, right?
Yeah, it's leasing like equipment, and basically especially on the freeze dried candy side and freeze drying, I know that there are a lot of companies who they are literally turning away business because they cannot keep up with the demand, not only with the machines to freeze dry it, but even if they had the machines, they can't hire or do it fast enough to fulfill the orders. So if you have a regional distributor that wants 100,000 bags of freeze dried candy a month for their first order, can you fulfill that in 60 days? Can you fulfill that in 30 days? And if you can't, then you're never going to get another reorder.
That's right.
And so even though $5,000 a month seems even still a lot, it's like, well, yeah, but now you can accept that order that gives you 50% of the deposit of that 100,000 unit. And now you do have the money to pay for that monthly expenditure.
That's right.
And now you have the logo to talk to other distributors that, hey, I'm doing fulfillment for this wholesale company that so now you can go and sell more. Now you can hire more people.
Correct.
And figure that all out.
That's correct. Yeah. And there's even some more creative approaches to this dilemma with the high entry level cost, if you will. Is oftentimes machines are offered now basically as almost like a printer back in the days with a click charge, right? Where the manufacturer of the equipment says, hey, let's do this 36-month contract, and you'll give us 1.5 cents per pack that runs through the machine, right? Now you have a direct revenue stream associated with that machine expense. And you can do a pretty clear calculation of what your cost will be for the unit. We've done something like this in the past. I mean, and of course, if you run a lot, then the machine costs a lot, but it gives you an entry to a piece of equipment and otherwise you would not have. Yeah. So there's many manufacturers who offer these very flexible, equipment acquisition systems now.
Hey, Josh, my next question is about the sales process that you have within EIS, because yes, we're talking hypothetically about different scenarios and things, but for someone who has a freeze-dried business and is trying to scale, what can I expect that process is like for you? What do you talk to me about? What do you want to know about? What should I have prepared for you?
It's important to do maybe some homework and find out what companies. There might be companies that specialize in your specific industry, right? So that could be the case too. And working with someone who specializes is oftentimes very beneficial because they've already done the mistakes, they have developed products around them, they know some of the answers that maybe a company who doesn't know your industry, would have to learn. That is actually most of the time the case for us. We are approached and we have a specific skill set that differentiates us from maybe some of the competitors, but that also means that we will have to learn about your industry, right? So if there's standard options standard pieces of equipment that are specifically made for your industry, we will always say, hey, we know someone, there's a company who caters towards this, and they can help you better than we can. Then we're entering the segment of the end of line, maybe some primary packaging, but secondary packaging all the way to the palletizing, where product gets handled, it gets batched, sorted, stacked, manipulated in some way. And on top of that, maybe the data is managed and tracked, right? So a big change to maybe even a few years ago manufacturing is that manufacturing, you had a production line, and a given machine or a production line was a source of a given product. And in today's world, typically production line is not only a source of a product anymore, it's also a source of a data stream. And especially as you go up in volume, you typically would like to know what's happening on the floor. What are we doing? Why are we down? How much throughput did we have? How much waste did we have? If we had downtime, why did we have downtime, right? So, and that's typically where we come in with our software packages and things like this, and we talk the customer through what he would like from us to get out of the system, and that is aside from all the hardware, right? But if you approach us, very common is we go through a project discovery phase, right? And the customer would reach out initially, and then we would basically hear the customer out. What are you doing? What are you currently doing? What would you like to achieve? And maybe also give some hints and tips on what we've done in the past and how can we see solving this problem for the customer, right? And that then goes into a stage two. Eventually, you've done a lot of exchange details, and we're talking sometimes weeks and months, right? And eventually you go to like a kickoff stage, at which point in time, if the customer does not write it in-house, we will write it for the customer, a very detailed statement of work. So a lot of the lines we design and implement have some tailoring to it, or they're specific to a product or specific to a process. So it's very important that you write down in detail what the requirements are and how we're going to solve them. So you have basically this unifying document where both teams know exactly what the expectation is and what the deliverables are, right? This is a very critical phase because that's where a lot of projects can go south. When things are said in a phone call, hey, I forgot to tell you something, and you're sitting on a red light out in the field, and don't you remember I told you this 6 weeks ago on the phone, right? Can't you remember I sent you that text message? And in the end, you have a unifying document to protect everyone from this kind of scope creep and miscommunication, if you will, right? And in the end, that increases the success rate dramatically. From there on out, once you find that agreement, we'll go to like a pre-design type stage where we make preliminary designs, talk it through with the customer, and always make sure we're communicating each step of the way with the customer. And once we have that, we go through the final design phase. Again, review this with the customer. This is also the point where somebody will be assigned a dedicated project manager. So the sales engineer will not be involved anymore, but a dedicated project manager will take over and basically manage all the given details. And we're going to design, build, fabrication, and then to final testing. So oftentimes at the very end, the last link in the chain is what's called an FAT or an SAT. Sometimes both. It's a factory acceptance test or a site acceptance test. And that's the point where you take out that statement of work from the beginning, and now you start checking boxes and say, does it do this? Does it do this? Does it do this? And if it doesn't, you have to correct it, right?
It sounds like it's very much like a general contractor for building a house or building a commercial space. You have to go through periods where you work with an architect to do the design and they coordinate with the structural engineers, the MEP, the electrical, all of that. And then it goes through kind of the permit stage and the design approval, and then you're ready to rock. But then you also are the one who helps on the general contractor side as it relates to construction, where you're saying, okay, this is the pieces that we need from this to assemble this area,
Hmm.
things like that. How are you able to do all this from your headquarters in Las Vegas for someone who's in Louisiana or someone who's in Florida? How are you able to help people across the country when it comes to the assembly part of it?
So there's a few different aspects to this, but I'm going to answer your question in terms of maybe geographic proximity. So we do have systems installed globally, and I'd have to think, but we have smaller system in Shenzhen, China. We have systems in England, Holland, Canada, Australia, and luckily we haven't had to fly out there yet, right? So every single piece of equipment we put out has remote login capability. So if a customer has an issue and he needs troubleshooting, all he needs to do is plug it into the internet port, and we can access the machine from anywhere in the world, right?
Wow,
So,
nice.
and we can help troubleshoot. So, to give an example, we helped the customer, I think maybe 2.5 months ago. They have one of our motion control servo systems. We helped them down in Argentina. So we logged in remotely from Las Vegas. We saw what was wrong with the system. The customer wanted a software update on the touchscreen. So we just reprogrammed the touchscreen, pushed the new software, and never had to fly, right? That's very powerful because it saves a lot of cost and time. So historically, you would have to schedule an engineer or a technician to go out there. So now it takes 2 weeks to get there. Now you have the flight cost, accommodation, per diem, right? The time. And what used to maybe be 2, 3 weeks is now a matter of waiting at the worst one day for someone to log in and solve a problem. In terms of complexity, I'll touch a little bit on this. So we specifically do not offer systems that fall into the category of what we call system integration. So system integration is typically a project where a system already exists, and then something gets attached to, added to, modified, because the farther the customer is away, and you have to do these types of integration services and piece of equipment that gets attached or added to, the success rate goes down.
Sure, I can see
Simply
that.
because we can't fully test 100% at our site, right?
Yeah,
Because you need that other piece of equipment to fully test the system, and designing and building something that we can't test 100% on site is typically projects we don't go out and offer to customers. Now, that being said, the closer it gets to Las Vegas, the more custom we will get, right?
yes.
Simply because we can serve that customer better. But we go and build systems for customers who are far away. Let's take a standardized pelletizer, right? We have a pelletizing system that is a standard product for us. Then not a problem. We can sell it to the East Coast because it's a standard piece of equipment. There's no custom aspect to it, or very little custom aspect. And then we can increase our shipping radius, if you will. So
Yeah.
the more standardized it is, the farther it reaches. The
I can
less
see that.
standardized it is, the shorter it reaches.
I can see that. So there's, for anybody, there's standardized ways of having things. You have your own products that are very easy for yourself to scale, but then you
Correct.
also have things that are going to be more customized. In freeze drying, we're freeze drying candy a lot of times, and a lot of candy comes in a wrapper form. Do you see there being any way to automate the unwrapping of candy? I can almost see, is it possible to have two robotic arms like on an assembly line, literally like catching each piece to pull it apart to like unwrap it?
We're entering the realm of very specific problems for
Yeah.
specific industries. Oftentimes, I think we underestimate how complex human motion, vision, and hearing actually is. Humans do very complex tasks without even noticing that they're doing complex tasks. So when you unwrap something, you have to have complex motion,
Yes.
multi-axis articulated motion, right? And that motion is guided by your visual instinct. So you would have to have a system that can see, know what it's looking at, identify the right contact points, and then dynamically guide an end of arm tool to do this in a different position for each piece, right? So
seems very expensive.
it's yeah, I mean, it gets really complex. I think we're now entering a stage where these things are very feasible, especially with AI vision technology, but they are not in the category of entry level.
Yeah.
And I would ask the question, if there's a significant volume behind that, could whoever's manufacturing the candy deliver it to the freeze dry industry unwrapped, right? Because we're also entering the space of how much waste are we generating, right?
Right.
So, and that might be okay if it's a few hundred pieces every day on a small level. Eventually, you probably would want to not have to unwrap it in the first place, I would guess.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. It's just a question that I was like, okay, I know everyone in freeze drying candy is doing this.
Yeah.
And so that was my question. But
yeah.
I
mean, you could probably have a tabletop setup where you don't pull it yourself anymore, but you can have a robot arm inserting the candy into maybe a 2-axis system, and this 2-axis pulls apart and rotates, and the candy falls out, and the paper is discarded, right? Yeah. So you could have a random pick robot, right, that picks from basically like a bulk tray, and then inserts it in a small unit and unwraps it, and it falls out. That's something that might be feasible on a tabletop setup, but even that might, drive costs in the tens of thousands of dollars. For a small project. And oftentimes not just the hardware, but if you sit down with an engineering team and they have to develop the solution, so there's a fairly large development cost typically associated with that.
Thanks a lot for joining us on the podcast and talking about this. I think there's a lot of great little nuggets that we've gained from this.
Yeah.
And it's definitely very helpful for us to think about as we're freeze drying and we're thinking about being entrepreneurs, ways to innovate so that we don't have to look at things that complicate things in our business. So
yeah, thank you, David. And I hope this was helpful to you and also your audience. And if you have any questions in the future, anything comes up, or one of your podcast listeners has any questions, feel free to reach out and we'll answer the best we can.
All right. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.